One of the most exciting features in Postman is the possibility of writing tests. So if you're tired of manually testing your APIs, then this video is perfect for you. I'll take you from zero to being able to test almost any common scenario in just a couple of videos. Hi there, this is Valentine and thanks a lot for joining me for this tutorial. In case you're totally new to Postman and you're just basically getting started or you don't know exactly what Postman is and how everything is working, I highly recommend you check out this video that I will link right here. It's an introduction to Postman and it will quickly get you started with the most basic things you can do with Postman. And then when you're interested in testing, you can just come back to this tutorial and take it right from here. Now in this video, we'll have a look at an API and work with 4 different HTTP methods: get, post, put, and delete. And we'll inspect the response status code and the response body and figure out how to write different kind of tests to make sure that the API is working the way we expect it to work. Now, in case your project or whatever you're working on is a bit more complex, there are 2 things you can do right now in the beginning. The first of them is to check out the description here below. I'll be posting a lot of links, and everything I talk about, you will find a link right there. Well, in the description, you will find a link to the Postman Quick Reference Guide. This is a document I created, and it's basically a collection of a lot of useful things that you will need in Postman. So every time you don't know how to do something, you can quickly check out the Quick Reference Guide and figure out how you can do that. The second thing you can check out is my online course on Postman, which is basically a journey for you as a tester, as a developer, no matter what you're doing. The course will take you from zero to building requests, writing tests, dealing with continuous integration, dealing with workflows, and a lot of other stuff. All along the course, there will be assignments and so on. So you may want to check that out as well. The link is in the description. Okay, now let's get started with this tutorial. For this tutorial, I'll be using a web service called http-bin.org. And it provides different kind of endpoints we can play around, and one of these endpoints are the ones I mentioned in the introduction as well, the get, post, put, and delete endpoints. So I'm gonna play a bit with these endpoints and see how they work and how we can make some assertions on them. So basically the 3 steps to writing tests in Postman are step number 1, and that is to get the request to work in the first place. The step number 2 is to understand the response body. And step number 3 is to write the actual test. So the first step is to construct a request and to manually do the step of inspecting what's going on. So you will probably want to say that you will get a status to 100 and that the response body looks the way you expected. And in this case, I'm using http-bin.org as I mentioned, and I'm using the get endpoint, and I'm passing an optional query parameter. And in case I want to work with these query parameters, I can do it by this panel. I can submit it a get. And basically what http-bin is doing is passing this information back to me. So let's try and have a look on how we can write our first assertion. So I'm gonna switch here to the test tab. And everything that's happening inside the test tab, this is JavaScript code. And if you haven't done that already, you should get an understanding on how JavaScript generally works. And I'm sure you'll find dozens of tutorials and stuff like that. It's also important to know that you can use pretty modern JavaScript here. So I'm talking at least ES6. So if you're looking for any tutorials, look for JavaScript ES6 as a version. Let's get started with the first assertion. You can see here in the right part, I have these snippets. And these are some just basic examples, but most of the time they are just enough to get you started. And you can easily browse around them to see what you can find there. And one of the most important and basic assertions that you can do while testing RESTful APIs is to simply check the status code. So if the API is properly working, the status code is one of the first things that you want to have in your tests. And now I just click status code is 200, and basically this is how a test looks like. And what this test will do is to simply check if the status code from this response is 200. So let me send this request once. I'll drag this a bit into view. So what you will see here is that the test result is 200, and it's also quite important all the time to make sure that your tests fail. So in order to get this to fail, I will write here, instead of get, something random, and I will get another status code, and that is 404 not found. And this is basically the test that my code here, that the assertion that I've done works properly. So I will just remove that. Let's run it again. And we're all back. Now, let's try a bit to understand how this all works. So every test in Postman needs to start with pm.test. And pm.test is a function that takes two arguments. The first argument is a string, and that is the name of the test. You will see it right here, status code is 200. And the second part is a callback function. And inside this callback function, which you can see starts here and ends here, you will write assertions. And this is our first assertion that we've done here, but we can write multiple assertions inside the callback function. Now, it's important to notice that the language that has been used here is a language that you can easily speak. So this reads out as pm.response to have status 200. And the whole point of the Postman test is to write them in a language that makes sense reading them even after you have written them, or if you're reading tests written by somebody else. Now, let's have a look at the more advanced scenarios. We already have here a response body, and you would like to make some assertions on the response body as well. So how about, for example, checking one of the arguments that we've submitted here? What if I want to check is good if it is true? And for that, we're gonna quickly use another snippet. So I'm gonna open the snippets panel, and so I'm gonna click response body JSON value check, and then another piece of code has been generated. I previously said that the first step is to get the request to work. Now, the second thing you need to know about is that you need to parse the response body. So basically everything that comes back from the server is just a piece of data. It doesn't have any meaning. And the way you do that in Postman is that you define a variable. In this case, this has been automatically generated by Postman with a snippet. It's called JSON data, but you can name it as you like. And what's happening is that PM response is the response body, and it's being parsed as JSON. Now, the response here is in the JSON format, so this is why this works. But if the response is in another format, and that's another tutorial, you will need to first parse that response body. So for example, if you are getting back XML, you need to parse that response to have a JavaScript object. And the JavaScript object that we are actually working with, because we can only work with objects because this is JavaScript code. And the JSON data object here is a representation of what we have here in the JSON format. Okay, now when this code is generated, it's usually put inside a callback function, but this can happen anywhere. So I'm just put it outside here, and let's actually use let, because var is a bit outdated. So what has been generated so far is something like that: JSON data.value to equal. This is basically the syntax. Now let's try to see how we can actually get to this is good part here. And I will show you a trick on how you can get that. Now, the first thing is that I'm gonna just get this out of here, and I'm gonna use a method called console.log. And this gives me the possibility of logging to the console anything. So every time I'm not sure what's going on, what I'm getting back from, what I'm getting back after parsing my response, I can use something like console log to get a bit more detailed information. And right here below, you can click on this and you will open the Postman console. Great. Now, when you send the request next time, there will be something logged here. So this JSON data is an object, and this object has some properties, and one property is arguments, args, and the other property is headers. This object has properties on its own, and the way you navigate in JavaScript when you're using such properties is by using a dot to connect those nested properties. So let me show you exactly what I mean. Now, the first object that we want to work with is JSON data. So we know that we want to get the is good from the arguments inside JSON data. So the first property we need to access is args. So I'm gonna put here a dot, I'm gonna write args. And then, because I want to access a property of the args object, I'll put in that property name. And that is good. But let's first have a look on how it's looking right now. So now I only have this object which has two properties. So whenever you are unsure about what to do, you just use the console log, and the console log will tell you how it's going. Now, I'm getting JSON data.args, that is good. And if I'm correct, then the console should indicate true. Okay, so now going back to our assertion, we know that we have the data that we want to assert. So this is the second important step. As I said, you need to parse the data and you need to get to the data that you want to assert, because otherwise it makes absolutely no sense to get into this testing if you do not have a way on how to get that information. And this expect, how it works is basically you give in an option, you give in expect, something that usually you get from outside, but let me just hard code it to explain you how it works. So you basically expect 1, for example, to equal 1. Okay, this is an expectation. It will always be true because nothing changes here. And of course, if you expect 2 to equal 1, that will not work, and the assertion will say that you expected 2 to equal 1, which obviously is not the case. Now, what we will do here is to remove this from console log and put it right inside our expectation here. And now we're gonna assert something to equal 1. And we expected here true to deeply equal 1, which is definitely not the case. So once again, let's say here JSON data.args is good to equal true. So let's have a look at this. This is still failing. and you're probably wondering why, and maybe you're scratching your head. Don't worry about it, I will explain. If you read more closely the error, you will see here that there's a bit of difference. So you expect it true, but between quotes, to deeply equal true without quotes. So what those simple quotes in JavaScript mean is that you are dealing with a string. So you're basically asserting that true as a word, as a string, equals a boolean. And they are in JavaScript different data types. Now, every time you're unsure about what kind of data type you have, you can either let such an assertion fail, but you can take advantage of another important feature. So if I'm going back to console, I can write something like type of and get my information. And when I'm inspecting the console, I will see here that this is actually a string. The same happens if I remove this property. Now you'll have an object. So you will know what kind of object, what kind of JavaScript type this is. So we know that now isGood is actually not a boolean, even though it looks like a boolean, but it's actually a string. So I'm gonna write here isGood to equal true. That's great. Now both tests work just as well. Now I don't need this console log, and I'm gonna leave this JSON data outside because I can write additional assertions here. Now let's imagine that we want to test is bad. And that will equal false. And the number of tests here remain the same, even though I have different assertions. And if I make this assertion fail, it will tell you exactly which test failed and which was the expectation that failed. Now, writing tests in this way is a good way to organize things around. There's nothing saying that you cannot combine this together. For example, you can even put this assertion here. That's absolutely no problem. The only thing you need to remember when using JSON data is that you need to first define it. Now, I will let you do the rest of it. For example, how about checking that headers cache control is no cache? Make that assertion and write a comment on how you solved that. Okay guys, thanks for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up. You can continue with the next video by clicking right here. Come on, click. Right here. Don't keep me waiting.